Clara Whitmore tore the letter in half with her bare hands right there on the platform, in front of everyone, in her wedding dress, with the dust of a town she didn't know settling onto her white hem like a judgment. She did not cry, not yet. She pressed both halves of the paper against her chest, closed her eyes, and breathed through her nose like a woman who had just been shot and hadn't decided yet whether to fall. The train was already gone. Everett was already gone. And every single person on that platform was already looking away. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that bell so you don't miss a single moment, because this story is just getting started, and I promise you it goes places you won't expect. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Black Hollow, Colorado, 1879, and let's stay with Clara, because she is not done yet. Not even close. The letter had arrived at the boarding house in Denver 3 days before the scheduled wedding, but Clara hadn't opened it immediately because she'd been too busy pressing the lace trim on her dress and humming to herself in a way she hadn't done since she was a girl in Virginia. She'd been happy. That was the part that hurt most when she thought about it later, that she had been genuinely, foolishly, completely happy. And the letter had already been sitting on the side table, like a quiet little murder, waiting for her to notice it. She'd opened it on the train heading west toward Black Hollow, because Everett had written that he would meet her at the station, and she'd wanted to read whatever final words he had sent before she saw his face. She expected something romantic, something awkward. Something that sounded like a man who didn't know how to say he was nervous about getting married. She'd been prepared to find that endearing. What she found instead were 6 sentences. The first sentence told her his plans had changed. The second sentence told her he had married someone else, the daughter of a railroad investor named Harlan Voss, a girl named Priscilla, who apparently came with a dowry that could buy half of Colorado Territory. The third sentence said he hoped Clara would understand, as these things sometimes happened, and she was a practical woman. The fourth sentence said he'd arranged for her luggage to be sent ahead to Black Hollow, and he was sorry for the inconvenience. The fifth sentence said there was money enclosed for a return ticket to Virginia. The sixth sentence said he wished her well, there was no money enclosed. Clara had read those 6 sentences 3 times on that train, with the Colorado wilderness blurring past the window and a woman across the aisle knitting something cheerful in yellow, and she had not made a single sound. She had folded the letter back into its envelope. She had placed the envelope in her bag. She had looked out the window for the remaining 40 minutes of the journey, watching the mountains get bigger and the sky get wider and the ground get harder, and she had rehearsed, in the private theater of her mind, exactly how she was going to survive this. She had not come up with anything useful by the time the train pulled into Black Hollow. The station was small, a wooden platform, a ticket window, a hand-painted sign that said "Welcome to Black Hollow Est. 1871, in letters that had been fading for at least 5 of those years. There were men in dusty coats and women with sharp eyes and children running in the gaps between adults. And every single one of them had turned to look at the woman stepping off the train in a white wedding dress, with a veil pinned into her dark hair and an expression on her face that said she was holding herself together by pure force of will. She had put the dress on in Denver because Everett's last letter, the real one, the one that arrived 2 weeks before this one, had said to come ready, that he wanted to marry her the same day she arrived, that he was too impatient to wait. She'd believed him. She had dressed herself in that boarding house room alone, pinned her own veil, told herself this was the beginning of something, and boarded a train in a wedding dress like a woman walking toward a miracle. Now she stood on the platform in that same dress while strangers stared. She did not fold, not yet. She walked to the edge of the platform and she stood very still, and she looked down the main road of Black Hollow as though she was simply taking a moment to appreciate the scenery, as though she had all the time in the world. As though a woman in a wedding dress standing alone outside a train station with 3 large suitcases was a perfectly ordinary thing that required no explanation. "That's her, ain't it?" said a woman somewhere behind her. "Not quietly. The one Collins left stranded," said a man. Heard he married the Voss girl last Saturday, said another woman. In Denver. Real fancy ceremony. Somebody ought to tell her the train back east leaves on Thursdays. A pause. Well, that's a shame. Clara heard every word. She had excellent hearing. She had spent 29 years in a household full of relatives who discussed her future as though she were furniture that needed reupholstering, and she had learned early to hear everything and react to nothing. She kept her chin level. She kept her hands loose at her sides. She watched a wagon roll down the main road, and a dog trot past the saloon, and a man lean against the post office reading a newspaper that was probably 2 weeks old. She thought, I have $4.37 in my pocketbook. She thought, I do not know a single person in this town. She thought, I am 29 years old, and I am standing in a wedding dress in a town I have never seen, and the man who was supposed to marry me married someone else last Saturday while I was pressing lace trim in Denver and humming to myself. She thought, I will not cry on this platform. I will not give them that. The afternoon wore on. The crowd on the platform thinned as people collected their goods and their relatives and their mail-order packages and drifted back into town. 2 men asked Clara if she needed help, but the way they asked it, the way their eyes moved over her, the way they smiled at each other before they spoke, told her exactly what kind of help they were offering. And she told them both, very calmly, that she was waiting for someone. Ain't nobody waiting for you, miss, the taller one said, and his companion laughed. I can see that, Clara said. I was being polite. Now I'm done being polite. Move along. They moved, but they laughed as they went, and she heard one of them say something she wasn't meant to hear, something crude and dismissive, and she turned her face toward the mountains so they wouldn't see what happened to her expression. The mountains were enormous. She hadn't expected that. Virginia had mountains, but they were soft things rounded by time, dressed in trees all the way to their peaks. These mountains were raw and gray and violent-looking, stacked against a sky so blue it seemed artificial, and there was still snow on the highest ridges even though it was late May. She stared at those peaks for a long time and thought about how small everything felt in front of them. How small she felt, how small Everett Collins was, a man who had sold her a future that cost him nothing and taken it back without even the courtesy of a conversation. The ticket seller came out at 4:30 and told her the platform was closing. The next train east doesn't come until Thursday, he said. He was a small man with glasses and a genuinely apologetic expression, which she appreciated. Is there someone in town you can stay with? No, Clara said. He looked uncomfortable. There's a boarding house on Cartwright Street. Mrs. Dunbar runs it. She's a fair woman. How much does she charge? He told her. Clara looked at the $4.37 she'd counted in her head and calculated how many nights that would cover and felt the first cold edge of real fear start to move through her chest. Thank you, she said. She collected her 3 suitcases. They were heavy. She'd packed for a permanent move, not a temporary visit, and she could only carry 2 at once, which meant she had to leave one on the platform and come back for it, which meant leaving the other 2 unguarded, which meant trusting that a strange town in 1879 Colorado would not rob a woman in a wedding dress in the 10 minutes it took her to make 2 trips. She was trying to work out the logistics of this, trying to figure out which case to leave first and how far the boarding house was, and whether she could ask the ticket seller to watch her bags without putting herself in his debt when the letter fell out of her coat pocket. She hadn't realized it was there. She'd tucked it in her coat in Denver and forgotten about it in the shock of everything, and now it was on the dusty platform boards at her feet. She bent to pick it up, and something in her, some last piece of discipline, just gave way. She straightened up with the letter in her hands, and she tore it in half. Then she tore each half in half again. Then she kept tearing until the pieces were too small to tear anymore, and she stood there with a fistful of confetti that had once been Everett Collins's cowardice, and she looked out at the street. She breathed very slowly, and she absolutely did not cry. She was still standing there, fistful of torn paper, wedding veil slightly askew, when she heard boots on the wooden platform behind her. Heavy boots. A man's walk, not hurried, not tentative, just steady and purposeful. the walk of someone who had somewhere to be and was going there at whatever pace suited him. "Ma'am," low voice, not unkind. Clara turned. The man standing behind her was tall in the way mountain men were tall, not polished or elegant, but large and solid, built for use rather than appearance. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired and dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since been weathered into something more serious. He wore a worn canvas coat, clean but patched at one elbow, and his hat was pulled low enough that she couldn't read his eyes well. He had two of her suitcases, the large ones, the heavy ones, one in each hand, and he'd picked them up without asking. She stiffened. "I know," he said. "You couldn't carry all three. I watched you working out the problem for about 10 minutes. I had it worked out. You were going to make 2 trips and leave cases unattended on an open platform in a mining town." Clara opened her mouth and closed it again, because that was in fact exactly what she'd been planning to do. "I'm Nathan Cole," the man said. "I have a ranch up above the valley. I come into town once a week for supplies." He said this the way a man recites facts, not introducing himself socially, but simply making his identity available, as if she might need to check him against a ledger. "I saw you on the platform when the train came in. You've been standing here for 3 hours. I'm aware of how long I've been standing here." "Yes, ma'am." He didn't apologize, which she found she respected. "Do you have anywhere to go?" It was such a plain question. Not pitying, not smug, not the kind of question that was really a different question in disguise. Just, "Do you have anywhere to go?" As if he genuinely needed the information in order to decide what to do next. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at her suitcases in his hands. She looked at the street. At the saloon 2 doors down, where she could already hear men getting louder as the afternoon got later. At the boarding house she couldn't afford for more than 2 nights. At the mountains she didn't know. At the road that led away from everything she had and toward nothing she could see. "No," she said. Nathan Cole looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he picked up the 3rd suitcase. "Then you do now," he said. "Come on." He started walking. Clara stood very still for a moment, the confetti of Everett's letter still in her fist, her wedding veil askew, her white dress gathering the dust of Black Hollow, and she thought about what a rational woman would do. A rational woman would ask where he was taking her. A rational woman would consider the dangers of following a stranger. A rational woman would walk into town, find the constable or the minister or any other figure of authority, and request assistance through proper channels. Clara was rational. She had always been rational. She had made a very rational decision to accept Everett Collins's proposal because he seemed stable and established and unlikely to humiliate her. And she had made a rational assessment of her limited options and her aging relative's patience and the shrinking number of respectable futures available to a woman of her age and circumstances. And every rational decision she had ever made had led her here, to this platform, in this dress, holding a fistful of torn paper. She let the confetti fall. Then she picked up her remaining bag and followed Nathan Cole off the platform. He walked without looking back, which she took to mean he trusted her to follow, or he didn't much care whether she did, and she couldn't decide which interpretation she preferred. The wagon was tied at the end of the street, a wagon, plain wood, with a pair of horses that were old and well-kept and deeply unbothered by the world. He loaded her cases in the back with efficiency and care, the way a man who had been loading things into wagons his whole life did it without thinking, and then he climbed up to the seat and waited. Clara climbed up on the other side. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her veil still pinned at an angle that was probably not dignified. They rode in silence for a while. The town fell away behind them. The road climbed steadily toward the tree line, winding up through dry grass and scrub brush, and the air got colder as they rose, and the mountains that had looked distant from the platform began to feel close enough to touch. "You don't have to explain anything," Nathan said without looking at her. "I'm not asking." Clara looked at the side of his face. "Most people would ask. Most people aren't taking you home," he said. "Their curiosity doesn't cost them anything. Mine's not their business." She thought about that. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you tore that letter into about 40 pieces and didn't cry," he said. "I know you told those 2 men off without raising your voice. I know you've been trying to solve a problem with $4 and inadequate luggage transportation for 3 hours, and you didn't ask a single person for help until you had no other choice. He paused. That tells me enough. Clara said nothing. The ranch is small, he said. I want you to know that before you see it and feel deceived. There's a main house and a barn, and about 200 acres of mostly mountain pasture. I run cattle, I do it alone. There's a second room in the house that I use for storage. I'll clear it out. I'll do it, Clara said automatically. We'll see. He said it without argument, like a man who understood that some offers were about dignity, not practicality, and knew better than to take that away from someone who had nothing else left. The road rose higher. The pines closed in on either side, dark and enormous, and Clara could smell them, that sharp, clean smell of resin and cold mountain air, and for a moment she felt something strange move through her, that wasn't grief and wasn't relief, but was something halfway between the two. Like the feeling of stepping out of a house that has been too hot and too crowded into air that is shockingly cold and clear. Nathan glanced at her. Why what? Why did you pick up my suitcases? He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. My mother came west from Ohio in '59, he said at last. She was 22 years old, and she'd been promised a house and a husband, and the husband was dead when she arrived, and the house was a tent, and the nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. He paused. Nobody helped her. She figured it out on her own because she had no choice, and she was fine, but she always said he stopped. She always said that one person stepping forward at the right moment would have made the whole thing less lonely. Clara thought about that for a long time. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman, she said. She was, Nathan said simply. She died 4 years ago. I'm sorry. So am I. The horses pulled them steadily upward through the last light of the afternoon, and Black Hollow disappeared below them, and the sky turned the color of embers above the highest peaks. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in Colorado territory to be a bride, and instead found herself riding toward a stranger's mountain wedding dress, sat very straight and breathed the cold air and told herself that she was still here. Still intact, still capable of whatever came next. She had $4.37 in 3 suitcases, and a wedding dress she was never going to wear again. It was not very much, but she had learned something in the last 6 hours that Everett Collins had inadvertently taught her by abandoning her. She was still standing. After all of it, she was still standing. That had to count for something. The ranch appeared around a curve in the road just as the last light failed. A low, sturdy house, a solid barn, the dark shapes of cattle in the upper pasture, a well, a woodpile, a small kitchen garden that had been recently turned. It looked nothing like the elegant home Everett had described in his letters. No front porch, with a swing, no flower beds. It looked like a place built to last by someone who cared more about endurance than appearance. Clara looked at it for a long moment. It's not much, Nathan said, and there was something in his voice, not apology, but honesty. The voice of a man who had learned not to oversell what he had. It's standing, Clara said. He looked at her, just briefly, before jumping down to tend to the horses. That it is. Come on inside. There's stew on the stove. Clara climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. Her wedding dress snagged on the wheel, and she heard the hem tear, and she didn't look at it. She walked to the back of the wagon and picked up her smallest case. I'll get those, Nathan said. I'll carry my own, she said. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something move in his expression, something brief and almost surprised, like a man who has asked a question and gotten an answer he didn't expect but can respect. All right, he said. And she carried her own case through the door of a stranger's house in the mountains, in a torn wedding dress, in the dark, in Colorado, in a life she had not chosen but had found herself standing inside of. And she set the case down next to the door, and she looked at the stove and the table and the simple clean room, and she thought, this is what survival looks like. Not elegant, not what she'd planned, but real and solid. And hers for whatever time she could earn it. Nathan came in with her other cases and set them by the wall without comment. He moved to the stove and checked the pot, added a piece of wood to the fire, and set 2 bowls on the table. Sit down, he said. Not an order, not quite. More like an invitation from someone who didn't know many softer words. Clara sat, and for the first time in 3 hours in perhaps 3 months, if she was honest, she felt something that was almost like safety. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of something that might in time become it. Outside, the Colorado mountains rose silent and enormous around the small ranch, and the first stars appeared above the highest peaks. And somewhere in the dark, a cattle dog barked once and went quiet, and the night settled in around them. And two people who had both been abandoned by people they trusted sat across a rough wooden table from each other and ate stew, and did not speak, and breathed the same cold mountain air, and began without knowing it, without meaning to, without any map for where this road might go to be less alone. The Clara didn't ask, she ate it. That was the first thing she learned about her new life, that there were questions she could save for later, and things she could simply accept in the moment. And that the difference between a woman who survived and a woman who didn't was often just knowing which category a thing belonged to. Venison stew on a cold mountain night in a stranger's kitchen fell firmly into the accepted category. So she ate, and she was grateful, and she did not say so out loud, because Nathan Cole did not seem like a man who needed to be thanked for basic human decency. He ate across from her in silence, not uncomfortable silence, that was the strange thing. She had sat through many silences in her life that felt like accusations, silences in her relatives' parlors that said, "You are a burden, and we are tolerating you." Silences from Everett in his letters, when she asked too many questions about the ranch, or the wedding plans, or what their life would actually look like. Those silences had weight to them, a kind of pressure that pushed against her chest. The silence was just quiet, the sound of two people eating. The crack of the fire, wind off the mountain, pressing against the walls. When he finished, Nathan stood and took his bowl to the dry sink and washed it. She noticed that. The fact that he washed it without being asked. The fact that he was a man who lived alone and still washed his dishes, and then he said, "The storage room's through that door. I'll clear it in the morning. You can take my room tonight." "I won't put you out of your own bed," Clara said. "You're not putting me anywhere," he said. "I've slept in the barn before." "It doesn't bother me," she said. "This is your home." He turned and looked at her with the same expression he'd worn in the wagon, that brief, almost surprised quality, like a man recalibrating. "Then take the storage room as it is," he said. "There's a cot under the grain sacks." "I'll get you a blanket." "That'll do fine," Clara said. He got her a blanket. It was wool, heavy and slightly rough, and it smelled like cedar and cold air, and she did not find fault with any of that. He showed her where the water was, where the necessary was out back, where the extra candles were kept, all of it delivered in the same flat informational voice he'd used in the wagon. When he was done, he nodded once, said "Good night, ma'am," and went to check on the horses. Clara stood alone in the storage room, with a candle and a blanket, and 3 suitcases and a wedding dress that was going to need significant repair, if it was ever going to be useful for anything. And she looked at the grain sacks stacked against the wall, and the old cot with its thin mattress, and she thought, "This is the best available option. This is not what I planned, this is what there is." She changed out of the wedding dress with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that the dress was still an object of value, even if it was no longer an object of meaning. She folded it and laid it across the top of her largest suitcase. Then she put on the most practical clothes she'd packed: a dark wool skirt, a plain shirtwaist, her heavier stockings, because she understood instinctively that the morning would require her to be useful, and she intended to be useful. She lay down on the cot and blew out the candle and listened to the mountain. It was louder than she'd expected. Wind, something moving in the pines. The horses shifting in the barn, cattle making low sounds in the dark. The whole world up here was alive in a way that her relative's house in Virginia never was. Never had been. That house was quiet with suppression, with the careful silence of people managing each other. Whereas this was noise that had nothing to do with her at all. The mountain simply was. It did not care about Everett Collins. It did not care about wedding dresses or railroad investors, or the opinions of the women on the platform who had watched her stand alone and done nothing. Clara fell asleep faster than she had in months. She woke before dawn, which surprised her, because she had never in her life been an early riser. But something about the mountain air or the unfamiliarity of the cot, or some deep animal instinct for self-preservation, had her eyes open and her mind alert before the first gray light came through the gap under the storage room door. And she lay there for exactly 1 minute deciding what to do, and then she got up. She found the kitchen by the residual warmth of the banked fire. She found the coffee, real coffee, which she hadn't expected, stored in a tin on the shelf, next to dried beans and flour and a side of salt pork. She found the pot. She built the fire back up, because she had watched enough servants do it in Virginia to understand the basic mechanics, even if she'd never done it herself, and she set the coffee on. And she stood in the kitchen in the early dark and listened to the mountain wake up. Nathan came in at what she later learned was his usual time, just at true dawn, when there was enough light to see by, and stopped when he saw the coffee. He looked at her. "I hope that's all right," Clara said. "It's your kitchen too," he said, and sat down. She gave him a cup. He drank it and didn't say anything about whether it was good or bad, which she took to mean it was acceptable. "What needs doing today?" she asked. Nathan looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You don't need to work." "I know I don't need to," Clara said. "I'm asking what needs doing." A pause. "Fence on the north pasture needs mending," he said. "Chickens need feeding. I've got to ride up to the high meadow and check on the young cattle. There's bread that ought to be baked." "I can do the chickens and the bread," Clara said. "I've never baked over a wood stove, but I understand the principle. I'll need you to show me the ratios for the altitude. I know bread rises differently up here." He stared at her. "What?" she said. "Most women say they can cook and then they can't," he said. "They mean they've supervised cooking." Clara set down her cup. "I have supervised cooking," she said honestly. "But I learn quickly, and I would rather tell you what I don't know than pretend I know it and waste your flour." That surprised him into something that was almost a smile. Not quite, but the corners of his mouth moved. "Altitude changes the leavening," he said. "Use less baking powder than the recipe says, and the oven runs hot on the left side." "Thank you," Clara said. That was the beginning of the education. The chickens were first. Nathan pointed her toward the coop and handed her a tin of feed and said nothing else. And Clara walked out into the cold morning air and opened the coop door, and was immediately surrounded by 11 chickens who had very strong opinions about breakfast and no hesitation about expressing them. She fed them. She collected 6 eggs and cracked one on the way back to the house because she hadn't known to hold the basket level, and she didn't tell Nathan about the cracked egg. She simply told herself she now knew to hold the basket level. The bread was harder. She made 2 loaves, and the first one came out dense as a river stone, and she stood looking at it with the expression of a woman who had survived worse than bad bread and was not about to be defeated by leavening. She ate a slice of it herself, truly bad, barely chewable, and then she made another one, adjusting the measurements, watching the oven more carefully, checking the temperature with the back of her hand, the way she'd seen the cook in Virginia do. And the second loaf was not good bread, but it was bread, edible bread, bread that a person could eat without feeling they'd made a mistake. She had it on the table when Nathan came back from the north pasture at midday, dusty and tired, and carrying a fence post he'd apparently needed to replace entirely. He sat down and ate 2 slices without complaint. "The first loaf's in the yard," Clara said. "The chickens are eating it." "Worse," she said. "But I figured out the oven." He looked at the bread in his hand and then back at her. "This is all right," he said, and the way he said it told her he was a man for whom all right was genuine praise. She decided then that Nathan Cole's all right was worth more than most men's enthusiasms. The days found their rhythm. Not easily. Nothing about those first weeks was easy. Clara had grown up in a house where physical labor was someone else's domain, where her value was measured in her manners and her needlework, and her ability to make conversation at dinner, and the mountain ranch operated by entirely different metrics. Her hands blistered and then calloused. Her back ached from carrying water. She learned to chop kindling by watching Nathan do it twice, and then insisting he let her try. And she split 3 pieces before she found the angle, and then she split wood every morning after that because it was a thing she could do, and the cold mountain nights required a great deal of wood. Nathan watched her learn without commentary. He corrected her when she was going to hurt herself when she was holding the axe wrong, when she was standing too close to the horse while brushing it, when she was reaching over the stove in a way that was going to put her sleeve in the flame, but he never said she was doing well, or praised her progress, or treated her like a student who needed encouragement. He treated her like a person who was figuring things out and didn't need his approval to do it. She found that she preferred that to the alternative. She had expected him to ask about Everett. People always asked. It was the most natural question, the most obvious opening. What happened? Who was he? Why did he do it? Did you see it coming? In Virginia, that would have been the conversation that never ended, the story that got told at every social gathering until she became nothing but the cautionary tale of her own misfortune. But Nathan didn't ask, and the other people she encountered in those first weeks, the occasional rancher passing through, the man who came to buy calves, took their cue from him and didn't ask either. And slowly Clara began to understand that the mountain operated by different social rules, that up here a person's past was considered their own business unless they chose to share it. She didn't choose to share it, but she thought about it in the evenings, when the work was done and the kitchen was quiet, and Nathan sat by the fire reading or mending tack, and she sat across from him with the mending she'd taken over because it was a thing that needed doing and she was good at it. She thought about the 6 sentences and what they'd cost her and what they'd accidentally given her. And she tried to work out how she felt about the entire situation now that the shock had worn off and the grief had had time to settle into something more like anger. She was angry. She discovered this gradually, the way you discover a bruise. You reach for something, and there it is, that sudden pain that tells you something was hurt more than you knew. She was furious at Everett Collins for the specific cowardice of it. For not writing sooner, for leaving her to travel all that way in a wedding dress, for the missing money, for the casual cruelty of "I hope you'll understand," as these things sometimes happen. She was angry at herself for not reading the signs more clearly. She was angry at the women on the platform who watched and whispered and did nothing. But the anger had an engine in it, and she started using it. About 3 weeks in, she noticed the account ledger. It was sitting on the small desk in the corner of the main room, open, and she saw the numbers on her way past and then stopped and went back because something about the column on the right side didn't add up. She wasn't trying to snoop. She was genuinely just walking past. But the numbers were wrong, and she had spent enough years watching her relatives manage household finances or mismanage them to recognize an error when she saw one. She stood looking at it for a moment and then went to find Nathan in the barn. "You've got an error in your ledger," she said. He looked up from the harness he was repairing. "What, the supply column for March?" she said. "You've subtracted it twice. It's made the balance look worse than it is by almost $30. He stared at her. "You looked at my ledger?" "It was open," Clara said. "I walked past. I wasn't looking for it, but I saw it and the number was wrong and I thought you ought to know." She paused. "I kept my relatives' household accounts for 6 years. I know what a subtraction error looks like." Nathan was quiet for a moment. $30, he said. 28 and some cents, Clara said. "Do you want me to silence? Then, let me see." She showed him. He looked at the ledger for a long time, checking her work against the supply receipts he kept in a box beside the desk, and his jaw was tight in the way of a man who does not like being wrong but likes being deceived by his own numbers even less. "You're right," he said finally. "I know," Clara said, and went back to the kitchen. She heard something from the main room that might have been a short laugh. She chose to believe that's what it was. After that, Nathan started leaving the ledger out. She wasn't sure if it was deliberate or if he simply stopped hiding it. But either way, she started checking it in the evenings, just looking it over, and she found 2 more errors over the next 2 weeks, small ones. The kind a man working alone without anyone to check his math would easily make, and she corrected them without comment and left the ledger as she found it. And Nathan never said anything about it except that one evening he came in from the barn and looked at the corrected column and said, very quietly, "Thank you," and she said, "Of course," and they moved on. Something was shifting between them. She felt it but couldn't name it. It wasn't the way she'd felt about Everett that had been something calculated and hopeful, and a little bit desperate, the feeling of someone reaching for a life raft. This was something quieter and stranger, like the way the light changed at high altitude, the way you looked up, and the world was somehow sharper and more real than it had been at lower elevation. She started noticing things about him, the way he moved around the animals patient, unhurried, never startling them. The way he spoke to the horses, low and direct, not nonsense sounds but actual words, as though he believed they understood. The way he fixed things. He didn't do things quickly. He did them right, and there was a difference that Clara had spent enough of her life around men who cut corners to genuinely appreciate. He never left a gate unlatched. He never left a fire unattended. He checked the animals every night before he slept, regardless of weather, regardless of how tired he was, because they were his responsibility, and he took that seriously. She thought, this is what a trustworthy person looks like from the outside. She had not thought about trustworthiness that carefully before. With Everett she'd trusted because she wanted to trust, because trust felt like optimism and optimism felt like strength. With Nathan, she found herself trusting, because the evidence kept accumulating small evidence, daily evidence, the evidence of a man who did what he said he would do, and didn't do what he said he wouldn't. About 6 weeks in, the first real test came. It came in the form of a man named Dolan Wade. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the horse in the yard, and then voices Nathan's and another man's, lower and with an edge to it that she could hear even through the wall. She wasn't the kind of woman who pressed her ear to walls. She was, however, the kind of woman who had a legitimate reason to refill the water bucket from the outside pump, and she took the bucket and went out. Dolan Wade was broad-shouldered and somewhere in his 40s, with the look of a man who had done well for himself in ways that didn't entirely bear examination. He sat his horse with the ease of someone accustomed to looking down at people and finding the angle comfortable. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that existed separately from whatever the man was actually feeling. Just saying, you might want to think about what you're doing, Cole, Wade was saying as Clara came around the corner. He glanced at her, and his smile broadened without getting warmer. This her, the mail-order bride that got left? She's a guest, Nathan said. His voice was flat. Guest, Wade repeated like he found the word amusing. That how you're calling it? He looked at Clara with the specific look of a man assigning her a category she hadn't consented to. Ma'am Dolan Wade, I own the Triple W spread south side of the valley. Clara Whitmore, she said, and met his eyes and held them, because she had learned early that looking away first conceded something. Whitmore, he said. Collins's girl. He's married to the Voss girl now, you know. Real nice wedding, I heard, Denver. I heard the same, Clara said pleasantly. Something crossed Wade's face. He'd expected a flinch. She could see that, and when he didn't get one, he recalibrated. Well, he said. He looked back at Nathan. Just a friendly conversation, Cole. I'm interested in the North Parcel. If you ever want to discuss a fair price. I won't, Nathan said. Land prices are good right now. Railroad's coming through the valley. I know about the railroad, Nathan said. The answer's still no. Wade's smile thinned. A man alone up here has more trouble than he needs to. Especially, his eyes moved to Clara briefly, when he's got extra complications. The silence that followed was the kind that had something hard in the center of it. You should get back to your own land, Nathan said. It's a long ride. Wade looked at him for a moment. Then he wheeled his horse and rode out of the yard without another word, and Clara and Nathan stood side by side watching him go, and neither of them spoke until the sound of hooves had faded down the mountain road. What does he want with the North Parcel? Clara asked. He wants all of it, Nathan said. Every piece of this valley that isn't nailed down. He's been buying out ranchers for 2 years, buying or pressuring. Nathan looked at her, both. Clara turned back toward the house. You'll want to make sure your deed's filed correctly with the county registrar, she said over her shoulder. Men like that look for paperwork errors. It's easier than outright intimidation. Nathan didn't move for a moment. How do you know that? He said. Because my uncle lost 40 acres in Virginia to a man who found a filing error and exploited it, Clara said. I watched a lawyer explain it to him. I paid attention. She paused in the doorway. Do you have a copy of your deed? In the desk, Nathan said slowly. I'd like to look at it, she said, if that's all right. He came inside and took the deed from the desk drawer and handed it to her without the hesitation she might have expected, and she sat down and read it carefully, the way she'd read her relatives' financial documents. Looking for the specific kinds of errors she'd learned to spot: incorrect survey references, missing witness signatures, inconsistent land descriptions. It took her about 20 minutes. Nathan sat across from her and waited, and she appreciated that he didn't hover. "It's clean," she said finally, and heard him exhale. "Filed correctly, survey references match, signatures witnessed and dated. There's nothing here for Wade to exploit legally." "You can tell that from reading it? I told you," Clara said. I paid attention. Nathan took the deed back and held it for a moment, looking at it the way a man looks at something he's relied on without fully understanding, and then he looked at her. "You keep surprising me," he said. "Good," Clara said. People who stop surprising each other stop paying attention. She got up and went back to the kitchen, and behind her she heard him laugh, a real one this time. Short and quiet, but genuine, and she carried that sound with her the rest of the afternoon like a small, warm thing she hadn't expected to find. The surprise wore in both directions. She discovered that Nathan had read more than she expected, not novels, not the kind of reading her relatives would have called civilized, but serious things: history and land law and veterinary medicine, all of it self-taught. The library of a man who had needed to know things and taught himself to know them. She found the books on the shelf beside the desk and started borrowing them in the evenings. And once Nathan came in and found her deep a text on water rights and the territorial land laws, and he stopped and looked at her, and then sat down at the table and said, "The chapter on prior appropriation is in the back. It's the relevant one for this valley." They talked for 2 hours that evening. She hadn't talked like that, really talked, arguing and questioning and building on each other's points, since the one semester she'd spent at a female seminary in her early 20s before her relatives pulled her back for reasons of economy. Nathan Cole had never been to any school beyond the age of 12, and he was one of the sharpest people she'd ever encountered, the kind of sharpness that came from necessity and application rather than inheritance. She told him so. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Don't reckon I've ever been told that before." "That's a waste," she said, and meant it. He looked at the fire for a while after that and didn't say anything, but something in his posture changed, some held thing releasing slightly. Like a door that had been stuck in its frame for a long time, and someone had finally pushed it at the right angle. But then came the night she learned what he was really carrying. It was raining, a hard mountain rain, the kind that had no patience and no mercy, and they were inside with the lamp lit, and Nathan was quiet in a different way than his usual quiet. Tighter. She noticed it the way you notice a change in the weather, before you can explain why, something in the set of his shoulders, something in the way he wasn't reading even though the book was open. She said nothing for a while. Then, "What's Wade actually after?" Nathan didn't look up immediately. "Then why?" "Because you went quiet differently when he came by today," Clara said. "And you've been somewhere else all evening. That's not about land prices." He closed the book. He was silent for a long time, the kind of silence where she could see him deciding, turning something over, measuring the cost of saying it against the cost of carrying it alone. "Wade and I go back," he said finally, "long way back." She waited. "I had a partner when I first came up here," Nathan said. "Man named Joel Pruitt. We came west together, built this ranch together, near enough. Cleared the land, filed the deed, started the herd." He stopped. "When the railroad first started talking about coming through the valley 3 years ago, just talk then, the land value jumped. Not much, but enough." His jaw tightened. "Joel sold his half of the deed to Wade without telling me. Said he needed money. Didn't say what for. Just signed it over one day and was gone, and I came home to find Wade standing in my yard telling me he owned 40% of everything I'd built." Clara went very still. "What happened?" she said carefully. "I fought it," Nathan said. "Spent most of what I had on a lawyer. The deed transfer was legal. Joel had the right to sell his half. But the way it was structured, Wade couldn't force a division of the land as long as I was actively running the ranch and generating income. So he's been waiting, and pressuring, and making it clear that he intends to own this land eventually." He looked at the fire. "He's been buying up ranches as they fail. This winter's been hard. The Carmichael place went last month, and the Hendersons are barely hanging on. Wade's got the whole south end of the valley now. And Joel a beat. Gone, Nathan said simply. Don't know where. Don't particularly want to. She understood then the specific shape of Nathan Cole's damage. Not just betrayal, she knew about betrayal, but the kind that came from inside your own life, from the person you'd stood shoulder to shoulder with. The person you'd trusted because you'd watched him work and eat and struggle beside you, and thought that meant you knew him. The kind of betrayal that made you look back at every moment of that friendship and wonder what was real and what was performance. I know that kind, Clara said quietly. He looked at her, really looked, for the first time in a while, with that direct, dark gaze that didn't flinch. I know you do, he said. The rain was loud on the roof. The fire was low. They sat in the quiet of two people who had arrived at the same wound from different directions, and neither of them tried to fix it, or minimize it, or find the lesson in it. Because sometimes a wound is just a wound, and the right response is to sit with another person in it without flinching. After a while, Nathan said, the ledger, the deed. You didn't have to do any of that. I know, Clara said. Why did you? She thought about it for a moment. The real answer, not the practical one. Because you picked up my bag, she said. On a platform where everyone was watching and none of them moved. And you didn't ask me to be grateful or to explain myself, or to be anything other than a person who needed something practical handled. She looked at him. That kind of thing costs something. You don't pay that back with gratitude. You pay it forward. So when I saw the ledger error, I corrected it. Because that's how it works. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. That's a philosophy, he said. It's the only one that makes sense to me, Clara said. He nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when something settles into place that he's been trying to locate for a long time. Then he put another log on the fire and picked up his book again, and she picked up hers. And the rain kept falling on the roof of the mountain ranch. And Dolan Wade was somewhere in the valley below, probably plotting something patient and legal and damaging, and Nathan Cole had 40% of his life owned by a stranger who was waiting him out. And Clara Whitmore had $4.37 and a rebuilt bread recipe and calluses where there used to be blisters. And none of it was resolved. And none of it was simple. But in the warm circle of the lamplight, with the fire and the rain, it was for the moment all right. She fell asleep in the chair with the land law book open on her lap and woke to find a blanket tucked around her shoulders and the lamp turned low and the fire carefully banked, and Nathan's chair was empty. And she didn't say anything about it in the morning, and neither did he. But she noticed. She noticed everything. The days started stacking up into weeks, and the weeks built something she hadn't anticipated, not just competence, not just survival, but something that felt dangerously like belonging. The chickens knew her step. The horses led her into their space without the sideways tension of a stranger. The bread was good now, genuinely good. And Nathan had said so, not with effusion but with the quiet confidence of a man stating a fact. She was chopping wood one morning. She'd gotten fast at it, faster than she'd expected, because it turned out there was something deeply satisfying about splitting a piece of wood cleanly along the grain. Something that used the anger she still carried about Everett and converted it into something useful when one of the ranch hands from the neighboring property came riding fast up the road. His name was Pete Givens, a boy of about 16 who sometimes came to help Nathan with heavy work, and he was riding with the urgent, sloppy urgency of someone carrying news. Mr. Cole, he pulled up hard. There'd been a rider down from Black Hollow bringing papers. Legal papers, addressed to you and a Mr. Wade both. Nathan came out of the barn fast. What kind of papers? Don't know, sir. Sheriff's deputy brought 'em. He left yours with the assayer. Says you're to come into town and sign for 'em. Nathan's jaw went tight. He looked at Clara. She had already set down the axe. Get the horses, she said. He blinked. You don't have to come. Those papers are probably about this land, she said. And you're going to need someone who can read a legal document without missing the parts that are designed to be missed. She looked at him steadily. Get the horses, Nathan. He got the horses. They rode down into Black Hollow together. And the mountain watched them go, and Dolan Wade's shadow was already long across the valley floor, and neither of them could know yet what the papers contained. But they rode side by side without discussing it, and that the side-by-side of it, the not having to explain or negotiate or justify, was something that Clara felt in her chest as she rode, something warm and solid and frightening in its newness. She had ridden toward Colorado territory alone, in a wedding dress, toward a man she thought she could trust. Now she rode toward whatever came next beside a man who had never once asked her to be less than she was. The difference was not lost on her. It settled in her chest like something she was going to have to be very careful with, because she knew she had learned this the hard way, in 6 cruel sentences, that the things you didn't protect were the things that got taken. But she also knew, and this was newer, this was mountain-taught, this was something she'd built in her own hands over weeks of cold mornings and blistered palms and corrected ledgers, that some things were worth the risk. Black Hollow appeared below them, small and dusty and full of people who had watched her stand on a platform and done nothing. Clara sat straight in the saddle and rode down to meet it. The assayer's office smelled like dust and old metal, and the particular anxiety of men who had recently received bad news. Clara noticed that before she noticed anything else the way a room takes on the emotional residue of the people who've passed through it. The way bad news leaves a kind of atmospheric trace that a person sensitive to such things can feel the moment they cross the threshold. The deputy was a young man named Briggs, who looked uncomfortable in his official capacity the way young men often did when they had to deliver something unpleasant to someone they weren't sure deserved it. He had the papers on the counter in a sealed envelope, and he straightened when Nathan walked in, and then he looked at Clara and seemed uncertain what category to assign her. "Mr. Cole," he said, "these came up from Denver on the morning stage." Filed through the territorial court, he pushed the envelope across the counter. "You'll need to sign for receipt." Nathan signed. He picked up the envelope and held it for a moment, and Clara could see the tension in his hands, not fear exactly, but the readiness of a man who has been waiting for a particular blow and is bracing for it even as he hopes he's wrong about where it's coming from. He opened the envelope. Clara watched his face. That was more useful in her experience than watching the document itself. The document would tell her what it said when she read it. His face would tell her immediately how bad it was. His face went still in the way that meant very bad. He set the papers on the counter, and Clara stepped forward and read them. It took her 4 minutes. She read slowly and carefully the first time through, the way her uncle's lawyer had once told her to always read legal documents not for the meaning you expect to find but for the meaning that's actually there, which was often different and almost always less favorable than anticipated. When she finished, she read the most critical section again. Then she looked up. "Wade filed a petition for partition," she said. Nathan nodded, jaw tight. "He's arguing that the joint ownership of the land can't be sustained without equal contribution of labor and capital," Clara said, "and that since his 40% share isn't being actively worked by him, he's entitled to a forced sale to resolve the division." She paused. "The petition was filed 3 weeks ago. The hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from today in Denver." "Can do that?" Deputy Briggs said, suppressing them both. He'd been trying to be invisible. "Under territorial law, a co-owner can petition for partition if they can demonstrate that the property can't be equitably divided in kind," Clara said. "The question is whether he can actually win that petition." She looked at Nathan. "You need a lawyer." "Had one before," Nathan said. "Cost me most of what I had." "You need a better one," Clara said. "One who knows partition law specifically." She looked back at the document. "The partition petition has a flaw. Wade's arguing joint tenancy rules, but if your original deed was structured as tenancy in common, which it appears to be, based on what I read last night, the legal standards for a forced sale are significantly higher. He'd need to prove actual harm from the continued co-ownership, not just inconvenience." Both men were staring at her. "Where did you learn that?" Briggs said. "I read," Clara said simply. She turned to Nathan. "Who filed your original deed?" "Lawyer named Harwick. He's in Black Hollow." "Then we start with Harwick," Clara said. "Today." Nathan took the papers from the counter and folded them back into the envelope, and Clara saw his hands were steadier than they'd been when he opened it. Not because the news was good, it wasn't, but because the news was now a problem with a shape to it. And a problem with a shape could be approached, analyzed, contested. It was the shapeless things that destroyed you. The 6-sentence letter. The friend who left without warning, the unknown. This was known. And Clara, God help her, was very good with the known. Harwick's office was 2 doors down. He was a small, dry man who had been practicing law in Black Hollow for 11 years and had the slightly defensive manner of a man who knew his limitations and didn't particularly enjoy being reminded of them by other people. He read the partition petition while Nathan and Clara sat across from his desk, and he made a series of small sounds that were not encouraging. "It's a legitimate filing," Harwick said. "I know it's legitimate," Clara said. "The question is whether it's winnable. The original deed, what were the specific ownership terms?" Harwick looked at her over his glasses. "And you are?" "She's with me," Nathan said. "She's helping," Clara said. "The deed, Mr. Harwick." Harwick found the deed copy in his files with the slow deliberateness of a man who didn't appreciate being rushed in his own office, and he read through the ownership terms, and then he looked up. "Tenancy in common," he said. 56 split coal 60, Pruitt 40. "Good," Clara said. "Under territorial partition law, a forced sale for tenancy in common requires the petitioner to demonstrate that the property cannot be physically divided without destroying its value. Can the north parcel, the 40% that approximately corresponds to Pruitt's original share, be divided from the main ranch without rendering either portion economically unviable?" Harwick blinked. Then he looked at the desk for a moment, and then back at her. "The north parcel is mountain pasture," he said slowly. "Grazing land, without access to the lower water rights, which belong to the main property. Then the north parcel alone is worth substantially less than its proportional share of the whole," Clara said. "Which means Wade's 40%, physically separated, loses significant value. Which means he has a strong incentive to force a sale of the entire property rather than a division in kind." "Yes," Harwick said. "But it also means," Clara said, "that his petition is actually self-defeating. He's arguing the property can't be equitably divided, but the reason it can't be divided is that his own parcel has lower standalone value. A court that examines the water rights structure will see that a forced sale of the whole benefits weighed disproportionately at Cole's expense. That's not partition law, that's legal maneuvering, and a territorial judge who understands property law will see it." Silence. Nathan was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the almost surprise she'd gotten used to, but something deeper and more complicated. Something that was working through some interior recalibration that was going to take more than a moment to complete. Harwick said, "That's a defensible argument." "It's more than defensible," Clara said. "It's the argument. But it needs to be made by someone who's argued partition cases before a territorial judge, not," she stopped herself with characteristic precision from finishing that sentence in the way she'd intended to finish it. Harwick heard the unfinished part anyway. "There's a man in Denver," he said, with the dignity of someone conceding a point that cost him something. "Name of Aldous Crane. He's argued 4 partition cases in the past 2 years. Won 3 of them. Write me his address," Clara said. Nathan put his hand flat on the desk. "Write it," she said to Harwick, without looking away from Nathan. "Please." Harwick wrote it. Outside the office, on the wooden sidewalk with Black Hollow moving around them and the mountains visible at the end of every street, Nathan stopped. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You keep saying that," Clara said. "I keep meaning it. And I keep not needing to hear it," she said. She turned to face him, and there was something in her expression that was about more than Harwick's office and Aldous Crane and partition law. "Nathan, Wade is doing this because he thinks you're alone. He's been watching this ranch for 2 years, and every time he looks, he sees one man, and one man can be worn down. Isolated, pressured into making a mistake." She paused. "He hasn't adjusted his calculations since I arrived." Nathan was quiet. Clara said. She started walking toward the horses. After a moment, Nathan followed. They rode back up the mountain road with the papers in Nathan's coat pocket and Crane's address in Clara's, and neither of them spoke for the first mile, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that said, "We both understand what just happened, and we're giving it room to settle." Then Nathan said, "How do you know all of that? The partition law, the tenancy structure, that's not household accounting." "No," Clara said. "My uncle's case, the 40 acres in Virginia, went to court. I went with him every day. I was the only one in the family who could follow the legal arguments, so I took notes and summarized them for evening. She paused. We lost. The other side's lawyer was better, but I understood every word of why we lost, and I never forgot it. Nathan wrote in silence for a moment. How old were you? He said. 22, she said. You sat in court every day at 22 and took legal notes for your uncle. There wasn't anyone else, Clara said simply. He didn't say anything after that for a while. But when the road got steep and her horse balked at a loose rock, Nathan's hand came out and steadied the horse's bridle without comment, just a steady grip and an easy release. And she thought that sometimes the things people said with their hands were more honest than the things they said with their mouths. The week that followed was the most productive and the most frightening of Clara's time on the ranch so far, and it set a pattern for everything that came after. She wrote to Aldous Crane in Denver and laid out the partition case with the clarity and precision she'd developed over a lifetime of paying attention to things people thought she wasn't paying attention to. She described the deed structure, the water rights issue, the disproportionate impact of physical division on Cole's 60% versus Wade's 40%, and she asked plainly what a defense would cost and what the realistic prospects were. She wrote 3 drafts and didn't tell Nathan she was writing them until the 3rd draft was finished, because she knew he would tell her she didn't have to, and she'd already established that she didn't need to hear that. When she showed him the finished letter, he read it twice. This is good, he said. I know, she said. Do you want to read it again, or should I send it? He laughed the real laugh, the short, honest one, and handed it back to her. Send it. She sent it on the next post day. While they waited for Crane's response, Clara began doing something else she hadn't mentioned to Nathan. She started talking to people. Not in Black Hollow, the women on the platform had long memories and she wasn't ready to give them the satisfaction of her need, but on the road at the trading post. At the small church in the Upper Valley where she started attending Sunday services, not out of sudden piety, but because churches were where community information lived, and she needed information. She learned that Dola bought out 6 ranches in the past 18 months. She learned that 2 of those sales had happened under circumstances that the former owners described, when pressed gently over coffee after service, as not entirely voluntary. She learned that a man named Emmett Birch had tried to fight Wade's pressure and found that his cattle kept getting spooked off his grazing land and his fence line kept mysteriously failing. And that after 3 months of that, Birch had sold at a price that was $50 below fair value and left the valley without looking back. She wrote all of this down in a ledger she bought with 50 cents of her own money from the general store. Not Nathan's ledger, hers. Dates, names, details, exactly as she'd heard them, and exactly as she judged them credible. She didn't tell Nathan about the ledger until it had 12 entries in it. When she showed it to him, he sat at the table and read every page and didn't say a word until he reached the last entry, and then he set the ledger down very carefully, like a man placing something fragile, and looked at her. Yes, Clara said, if this is documented. If it's documented and presented correctly to the right court, yes, Clara said. It's not proof of anything criminal by itself, but it establishes a pattern of coercive behavior that would be very relevant context in a partition hearing. A judge looking at Wade's petition and also looking at this ledger would see a man who doesn't buy land, he takes it. Nathan looked at the ledger again. You've been doing this for 2 weeks, he said. On Sundays, Clara said, and Tuesday afternoons when I go to the trading post. I thought you were buying thread. I was buying thread and talking to people, she said. I'm good at talking to people. I was trained for it. My relatives just never aimed it at anything useful. Nathan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed out slowly through his nose. And Clara watched him process the specific feeling of having someone in your corner who had been quietly building your defense while you were mending fence lines and feeding cattle. And she recognized that feeling because she'd experienced the absence of it for so many years that the presence of it was almost unbearable. I don't know what to do with you, he said finally. You don't need to do anything with me, Clara said. You need to write a letter to each of the people in that ledger and ask if they'd be willing to provide a sworn statement. He looked at her, he said. Emmett Birch will, she said. He's in Pueblo now. I wrote to him. A pause. You wrote to Birch, Nathan said slowly. Last week, Clara said. He responded day before yesterday. He'll provide a statement. He said. She paused, checking her memory for the exact words. He said he's been hoping someone would put it all together. Nathan was very still. What else have you done, he said. Not accusatory. More like a man who has discovered that the ground he thought he was standing on goes considerably deeper than he knew. Clara thought about it. I've been corresponding with the Territorial Land Office about the survey records for this valley, she said. Wade's purchases, specifically the Carmichael Place, the survey line, runs through the section that he's been claiming is south of the water access easement. If the survey records show what I think they show, Wade's been grazing cattle on land that's technically still in easement to this ranch. Nathan, he said. She showed him the letters. He read them standing at the desk, leaning over the papers with the intensity of a man who had been watching his world narrow for 2 years and was only now seeing the possibility that it might widen again. Then Crane's letter arrived from Denver. It came on a Thursday in a thick envelope that meant the man had taken her letter seriously, and Clara took it from the postwriter's hand herself and stood in the yard and opened it and read it before she went inside. Aldous Crane had read her summary of the case. He had several technical questions about the deed language and the water rights structure. He wanted to see the original survey records for the North Parcel. He thought the case was defensible and that the partition petition had real vulnerabilities. His fee was $120 for representation through the hearing, with the first 40 due within 30 days. She read that number and felt something cold move through her. Nathan was standing in the doorway. He'd seen her face. How much, he said. She handed him the letter. He read it and handed it back. I can get $40, he said barely, but I can get it. He paused. The rest 6 weeks, Clara said. Clara. The spring calves, she said. You were going to sell them at the summer market. What's the market price if I sold all of them? How much, he 60, if prices hold. Then we need 60 more and we have 6 weeks, Clara said. What else can be sold? Nothing that doesn't hurt the operation, Nathan said. Clara looked at the mountains. She was quiet for a moment, and Nathan let her be quiet because he'd learned by now that her silences were not empty. The dress, she said. He blinked. What? My wedding dress, she said. It's silk, good lace. Even with the hem damage, it's worth money to the right buyer. Mrs. Harwick, the lawyer's wife, I noticed her looking at it the first time I came into town. She paused. She mentioned she has a daughter being married in the fall. Nathan stared at her. You'd sell your wedding dress, he said. I'm never going to wear it again, Clara said practically. It's fabric, expensive fabric. She looked at him. Do you have anything against expensive fabric paying your legal fees? He didn't laugh this time. He looked at her with something so direct and so unguarded that she almost stepped back from it. Because she wasn't used to being looked at that way, not like a solution to a problem, not like a pleasant thing to observe, but like someone who had just done something that mattered. No, he said quietly, I don't have anything against that. The dress sold for $35. Mrs. Harwick drove a hard bargain, but Clara drove a harder one. And she walked out of Harwick's parlor with $35 in her hand and a feeling in her chest that was somewhere between triumph and something rawer that she didn't examine too closely. She put it with the 40 Nathan had scraped together, and they sent the first installment to Crane that same week. But the story was not just the partition petition. The same week Crane's letter arrived, something happened that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with Nathan. She had been in the barn late. One of the mares was due to foal, and Clara had taken to checking on her in the evenings when she heard Nathan's voice from the other side of the partition wall. Not talking to the animals in his usual way, talking on a lower register, the one she'd learned to recognize as the register of things he didn't intend to say out loud. She wasn't eavesdropping. She just hadn't moved, and he hadn't known she was there, and she heard him say into the dark, to no one, I should have seen it coming. I should have seen all of it coming. He meant Joel Pruett. She knew that without question. She stood very still on her side of the partition wall, and the mare breathed warmly beside her. And Clara thought about all the ways a person could be ambushed by someone they trusted, about how the ambush didn't announce itself. about how the particular cruelty of betrayal was that it was only visible in retrospect when you could do nothing with the vision. She didn't say anything. She waited until he'd gone inside, and then she checked the mare and went in herself, and the next morning she said nothing about it. Because she understood instinctively that some things a person needed to say out loud to the dark once, and not have it handed back to them in daylight. But she thought about it. She thought about the way Nathan moved through the world with the specific caution of a man who had been burned badly, not cold, not unkind, but careful. Always careful, never letting anything get too close too fast. Treating trust as a resource that had to be earned through sustained, consistent behavior, not granted on instinct or hope. She knew what that felt like. She also knew what it cost. It cost you things you didn't know you were paying for until you tried to reach for them and found your own hand in your own way. 3 weeks before the Denver hearing, Dolan Wade came back. He came with a man she didn't recognize, taller than Wade, city clothes, the slight self-possession of a lawyer who knew he was the most educated person in the room and had stopped being embarrassed about enjoying that fact. They came in a hired buggy, which was a statement of its own kind, and they arrived at the ranch midday when Nathan was at the far end of the property and Clara was alone. She saw them coming up the road from the kitchen window, and she made a decision before they reached the yard. She did not go inside. She did not find a reason to be somewhere else. She came out onto the porch and she stood with her hands loose at her sides and she watched them arrive. Wade tipped his hat. The lawyer didn't bother Miss Whitmore, Wade said. Is Cole about? Mr. Cole's working, Clara said. Is there something I can help you with? Wade's smile was doing the thing it always did, existing on the surface of his face without any real connection to whatever was behind his eyes. Just a social call, he said. Thought we'd stop in, see how things are going up here. Heard you've been spending time in town, asking questions. She kept her expression exactly level. I talk to people, she said. Wade said. His eyes moved over her in a way that was assessing rather than admiring, checking, she thought, for signs of discomfort, for the small telltale signals that a person was bluffing or afraid. This here's Harrison Price. He's my legal representative in the Denver matter. Price said nothing. He was watching her with the same clinical attention she'd noticed. Lawyers developed reading for the gap between what a witness said and what they meant. Mr. Price, Clara said. Ma'am, Price. And then, with the casual precision of a man who wanted to see what fell, we understand you've been in correspondence with Aldous Crane in Denver. Clara felt the confirmation of what she'd suspected. Wade had sources in town. Someone had talked. Possibly the post writer, possibly someone at the assayer's office. Possibly just the kind of casual information leak that happened in small communities where everyone knew everyone's business and didn't always know whose side they were supposed to be on. I correspond with many people, Clara said. Of course, Price said. We're simply curious in what capacity. You're not a party to the petition, after all. You have no legal standing in the matter. I'm aware of my legal standing, Clara said. And I'm aware that advising and assisting is not the same as having standing. I've been helping Mr. Cole organize his response to the petition. That's not a legal act, that's just one friend helping another. Price smiled thinly. Friend, is that surprising? Clara said. It's interesting, he said. A woman with no formal legal training, no standing, no financial stake in the property. I have a financial stake in anything that affects the household I'm part of, Clara said. And I have sufficient educational background to assist in document organization. Neither of those things is your business, Mr. Price. Wade's smile had been getting tighter throughout this exchange. We're not here to make trouble, he said, the way men who were specifically there to make trouble always said it. We're here to make an offer, then make it, Clara said. Wade reached into his coat and brought out an envelope. Cole sells his 60% to me at the current fair market price. I had it assessed last month, the numbers in there, and we settle this without a Denver hearing. He held the envelope toward her. Clara did not take it. I'm sure it is, she said. But it's not my offer to take. You could pass it along, Wade said. Encourage him to consider it seriously. A man in his position. A man in his position has an attorney handling his affairs, Clara said. Any offer should be directed to Aldous Crane in Denver. I'll give you the address if you don't have it already, though I suspect you do. The silence that followed had a different quality than the earlier ones. Wade was no longer smiling at all. You're making a mistake, he said. And this time the social performance was gone, and there was just the flat statement underneath it, the thing that had always been behind the smile. Possibly, Clara said. I've made mistakes before. I've learned to tell the difference between a mistake and a principle. She looked at him steadily. This is a principle. Price put his hand on Wade's arm, a small, professional gesture that meant we've accomplished what we came to accomplish. Let's leave before we give anything away, and Wade let himself be guided back to the buggy. Though he looked at her once more before he climbed up. A long look that was about more than this afternoon, more than this ranch. A look that was categorizing and measuring and deciding something. She held his gaze until the buggy turned around and headed back down the road. Then she went inside and sat down at the table and put her hands flat on it and breathed. When Nathan came in at dusk, she told him everything: Wade's visit, Price, the offer, what she'd said. She told it plainly and completely and without editorializing, and Nathan sat across from her and listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he said, You told them to contact Crane. Yes, Wade is not going to respond well to that, Nathan said. No, Clara said, he isn't. It might make things harder up here. It might, she said. But giving them what they want now makes things permanently harder. The choice is between a difficult period and a permanent one. Nathan looked at the table for a moment. He threatened you, he said, and the way he said it was quiet, the particular quiet of a man who was not raising his voice because raising his voice would not adequately express the thing he was feeling. He implied consequences, Clara said. He didn't make an explicit threat. He scared you, Nathan said. She considered denying it. She was perfectly capable of denying it convincingly. But she'd made a decision somewhere along the way. She wasn't sure exactly when, possibly in that barn on the night, she heard him talking to the dark, that she wasn't going to be less than honest with this man. Yes, she said, for about 30 seconds after the buggy turned around. Then I got angry, and the angry is easier to work with. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not romantic, or not only that, not with any of the calculation of romance. Just the gesture of one person reaching toward another to say, I see what you just did, and I see what it cost you, and you were not alone in it even if you were standing on the porch by yourself. Clara looked at his hand on hers. She turned her hand over. Neither of them said anything about it. He pulled his hand back after a moment and stood up and went to check on the animals, the way he did every evening, and she sat at the table and listened to him cross the yard. And she thought about what it meant that she had been stood in a wedding dress on a platform 6 months ago, with nothing but $4.37, and the absolute certainty that she had no future. And now she was sitting in a mountain ranch kitchen, with calloused hands and a legal ledger, and a letter from Aldous Crane and the warm print of a hand over hers, and she could not have predicted any of it. She could not have predicted any of it, and she was not afraid of it. That itself felt like something worth paying attention to. But the piece of that evening was the last piece for a long while, because 2 days later they found the north fence down, not from weather, not from cattle pressure, but cut. Clean cuts, wire ends bent back, the kind of thing that took tools and intention. 3 young steers had gotten out into the forest pasture, and it took Nathan and Pete Givens and Clara most of a morning to round them up. And by the time they had the fence repaired, Nathan's face had the stillness of a man who had moved past anger into something colder and more purposeful. He's escalating, Clara said when they were back at the ranch. Then so do we, she said. I need to write to Crane today. The fence cutting is relevant to the hearing. It demonstrates continued harassment and changes the legal context. This isn't just about property division anymore. This is about a systematic campaign to devalue and destabilize a functioning ranch operation. Nathan looked at her. You knew this was coming, he said. I suspected it, she said. Men like Wade, they're patient until they aren't. The petition was the legal move. The fence is the reminder that he has other options. He wants you scared enough to settle before Denver. He's going to be disappointed, Nathan said. Yes, Clara said. He is. She wrote to Crane that evening, 3 pages. Detailed, precise, with dates and descriptions, and the names of Pete Givens and herself as witnesses. She cross-referenced it with the entries in her ledger, the pattern she'd documented from the other ranchers. The same playbook applied to the same end. While she was writing, Nathan was at the other end of the table, cleaning his rifle, with the methodical care of a man who didn't intend to use it, but wanted it available, and in good condition in case the calculation changed. They worked in silence, the lamp between them, the mountain wind against the walls. And it was strange, Clara thought, how a thing could be frightening and right at the same time. How you could look at a situation that was objectively dangerous, a powerful man with resources of some nature who had won before and intended to win again, and still feel, underneath the fear, a bedrock certainty that you were exactly where you were supposed to be, doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing. She sealed the letter. She looked at Nathan across the lamp. In the morning, she said, I want to ride the full fence line. He looked up. The whole perimeter, she said. I want to know exactly what we have and exactly where it's vulnerable, so when Wade makes his next move, and he will, we know before he does how it's going to work. Nathan set down the rifle cloth. You ride the east line, he said. I'll take the west. Clara nodded. She blew out her candle and went to bed, and in the dark she listened to the mountain and thought about legal hearings in Denver, and cut fences and a hand over hers and $4.37. And she thought about how far she was from the woman who had stood on that platform in a wedding dress, not knowing whether she was going to have a place to sleep that night. That woman felt like a stranger to her now, not because she'd been weak, but because she'd been alone. She was not alone anymore. And Dolan Wade, for all his lawyers and his buggy and his patient, expensive smile, had no idea what that meant. He was about to find out. They rode the full fence line the next morning, east and west, and the east line was clean, but the west line had 2 more sections that had been tampered with, not cut all the way through, just weakened. The wires twisted and stressed in ways that would hold for now, but would fail in the first hard wind or the first sustained pressure from cattle. It was careful, deliberate work, the work of someone who understood ranching well enough to know exactly how much damage to do to ensure maximum inconvenience without leaving evidence obvious enough to constitute proof. Clara documented both sections in her ledger before they repaired them. She measured the distance from the property line. She noted the direction of the nearest W fence posts, visible from where she stood. She wrote down the date and the time and the weather and the names of everyone present, which was herself and Nathan and Pete Givens, who had come along that morning with the quiet reliability of a boy who understood that some situations required witnesses without needing anyone to tell him so. You're building a case, Pete said, watching her write. Yes, Clara, for the hearing? For whatever needs it, she said. Pete nodded with the gravity of a 16-year-old who had decided this woman was someone worth paying attention to, and Clara appreciated that without saying so. They sent the fence documentation to Crane the same day, and Crane wrote back within the week with news that shifted the entire shape of what was coming. He had filed a counter motion in the Denver Territorial Court, arguing that the partition petition should be dismissed on the grounds that the petitioner had engaged in systematic harassment, property interference constituting tortious interference with the co-owner's lawful use of the property. It was not, Crane wrote carefully, a guaranteed win on the counter motion. But it changed the posture of the case from defense to offense, and it told Judge Alderman, who was hearing the matter, that this was not a simple property dispute, but something considerably more complicated and more serious. Nathan read the letter twice and then set it on the table and looked at Clara. He used the fence records, he said, and Emmett Birch's statement, Clara said. And the survey discrepancy I flagged about the Carmichael easement. All of it together. It's not over, it's not close to over. But we're no longer just absorbing what Wade throws. No, Nathan said, we're not. Something had changed between them since the evening he put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, nothing about Nathan Cole happened dramatically. She'd learned that much, but in the daily texture of things. In the way he spoke to her. In the way the silences had shifted from the comfortable quiet of 2 careful people keeping their distance to something warmer and more complicated. He looked at her differently, not constantly, Not openly, but at moments when she said something precise and useful, when she solved a problem he'd been stuck on. When she laughed at something unexpected, she would catch him watching her with an expression that he didn't bother to compose away. She was watching him too, she knew that. She wasn't blind to her own behavior. But she was also aware, with the specific awareness of a woman who had made one very large mistake about a man, that feeling something was not the same as knowing what to do with it. And that the mountain ranch in the weeks before a legal hearing was not the moment to find out. She was still working through what she thought about that when the thing happened that made all of it suddenly less important and more important at the same time. It happened on a Tuesday 3 weeks before the Denver hearing. A rider came up the mountain road at a pace that said urgency, and Clara was hanging washing on the line when she saw him coming and felt, before she could name why, a cold premonitory certainty that whatever this was, it was going to change something. The rider was a man she didn't know, young, from the valley, with the look of someone who had been sent with news he didn't want to deliver. He asked for Nathan Cole. Nathan came out of the barn. The man reached into his coat and produced a letter that had clearly been opened and resealed. Not carefully enough, the seal was cracked and he handed it over with an apology that he delivered to his hat brim rather than to Nathan's face. Nathan read it. Clara watched his face go through 3 things in rapid succession: recognition, then a kind of cold disbelief, then something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief but occupied the territory between them. "What is it?" she said. He handed her the letter without a word. She read it. It was from Joel Pruitt. He was in Santa Fe. He had been in Santa Fe for 8 months, working in a livery stable, and he had heard through the particular telegraph of Western gossip that connected towns separated by hundreds of miles that Nathan was in legal trouble over the land. He was writing, he said, because he wanted Nathan to know something. He wanted Nathan to know that he hadn't sold his share of the deed to Wade voluntarily. He had been in debt. Gambling debt, the kind that carried consequences that had nothing to do with courts or laws. The men he owed had told him he had 2 choices: sign over the deed share or face consequences, he described in the letter in terms vague enough to be terrifying. He had signed. He had left because he was ashamed. He had not written because he was a coward. He was writing now because he had heard Nathan was fighting Wade and he thought Nathan should know the truth, for whatever it was worth. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once, in different ways, as if repetition might accomplish what one instance couldn't. He said he would provide a sworn statement if it would help. Clara read the letter twice and handed it back to Nathan. The rider had been paid and dismissed while she was reading, and now they were alone in the yard, and the washing was moving on the line, and the mountain was enormous and indifferent all around them. And Nathan was holding Joel Pruitt's letter in both hands with the careful stillness of a man holding something that could shatter. "He was coerced," Clara said quietly. "I know what it says." "Nathan, I know what it says, Clara." His voice was level, but level in the way of water behind a dam, not calm, not peaceful, just contained. 3 years. 3 years I've been believing he chose money over everything we built. 3 years I've been He stopped. She waited. "It doesn't fix what happened," he said finally. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. The land's still 40% Wade's." "Yes, Joel's still gone, yes." He looked at the letter in his hands. "But it means I was wrong about why." Clara said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. Being wrong about the reason behind a betrayal was its own complicated grief. It didn't cancel the damage, but it shifted the story. And shifting a story you had lived with for 3 years was disorienting in ways that didn't resolve quickly. She gave him time with it. She went back to the washing and finished hanging it. And she could feel him standing in the yard behind her, not watching her, just existing there, in the same space, figuring something out. After a while he said, "Is this useful?" to Crane. Clara turned around. He was looking at her with the expression she'd come to understand meant he was asking her to do the thing she did, set aside the emotional weight and tell him what the practical reality was. He wasn't dismissing the emotional weight. He was trusting her to hold the practical line while he dealt with the other. She thought about the letter, about what it meant legally. "It's potentially very useful," she said carefully. If Pruitt was coerced into selling his share of the deed, the transfer may be voidable. It depends on how the coercion can be demonstrated and what documentation exists. But at minimum, a sworn statement from Pruitt about the circumstances of the sale fundamentally changes the story Wade has been telling, which is that he acquired his share through a legitimate voluntary transaction. Nathan was very, he said. Potentially, she said. I'm not certain. This is exactly the kind of question Crane needs to evaluate. But Nathan, she paused, making sure she had his full attention. If the deed transfer was coerced, and if that can be demonstrated to the court's satisfaction, Wade may not own 40% of this ranch at all. The silence that followed, that was one of the longest she'd sat inside of. Then Nathan said right to Crane. I already started the letter in my head, she said. Something moved across his face that was too complicated to name. Of course you did, he said, and it wasn't quite a laugh, but it was the thing that lived in the same neighborhood. The letter to Crane went out the next morning with Joel Pruitt's letter enclosed and a 2-page analysis of the legal implications as Clara understood them. Crane responded 4 days later fast for him, which told her he understood the significance, and his response was 3 pages of carefully precise legal language that she read 3 times and then summarized for Nathan in plain terms. Crane thought the coerced transfer argument had genuine merit. He was going to request a 60-day continuance of the partition hearing to investigate the circumstances of the original deed sale. He wanted Pruitt's sworn statement immediately. Clara wrote to Joel Pruitt in Santa Fe the same afternoon. She did not tell Nathan what she wrote in that letter, not all of it. She told him she'd asked for the sworn statement and the relevant details of the coercion. What she didn't tell him was the other paragraph, the one at the end, where she had written to Joel Pruitt not as a legal strategist but as a person who understood what it was to carry shame for a long time. She told him that providing the statement was not going to make everything right, and she wasn't going to pretend it would, but that there was a difference between a mistake you made and abandoned, and a mistake you made and tried to address, and that he had an opportunity now to be the second kind of man rather than the first, and she thought he ought to take it. She didn't know if it would work. She had written it because it was true, and because she thought it needed saying. 3 weeks before the Denver hearing, with the continuance granted and the case temporarily suspended, Clara thought they had bought themselves time. She thought the worst was behind them for the moment. She thought wrong. The storm came on a Thursday. It came the way mountain storms always did, faster, that had seemed to promise, harder than the air temperature had suggested. With the specific violence of weather that had built itself up over hundreds of miles of open range and arrived with a full head of momentum and no patience. Nathan had been watching the sky since midday, and he told Clara at noon that it was going to be bad. How bad? She said. Bad enough that I need to get the young cattle down from the high meadow before dark, he said. They'll spook in lightning if they run in the dark at that elevation. Go, she said. I'll handle things here. He looked at her for a moment, the look she'd learned to read, as him doing a rapid and honest assessment of whether the thing he was about to leave her with was manageable, and whether she was capable of managing it, and apparently the assessment came out in her favor, because he saddled up and rode toward the high meadow with Pete Givens. And Clara started closing shutters and moving things in from the yard and filling the water barrels from the well, because she'd learned enough about mountain storms to understand that you prepared before you needed to. The storm hit at 4 in the afternoon. It was genuinely one of the most ferocious things she had ever experienced. Not a gentle rain, not a dramatic thunderstorm she might have watched from a Virginia porch with a cup of tea and mild appreciation for nature's spectacle. This was a full mountain storm wind that made the walls shake, lightning that lit the whole ranch in white flashes, with no interval between it and the thunder, hail that hit the roof like something furious and personal, rain so heavy it turned the yard into a moving surface of mud and water. Clara did not panic. She had made a decision somewhere in the first 6 months on the mountain that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. And she had applied that decision to enough difficult situations by now that it was a habit rather than an effort. She checked the barn. The horses were tied and unhappy, but secure. She banked the fire and moved the lamp away from the window, and she sat at the table and listened to the storm work through its fury, and she waited. Nathan should have been back by 5. At 6 he was not back. At 7 the storm was still full force and Nathan was not back, and Pete Gibbons's horse came into the yard alone. Just the horse, alone, moving fast and wild-eyed, with one stirrup hanging wrong in mud on the saddle. Clara stood on the porch and looked at that horse for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went into the barn and saddled her own horse, the steady roan that Nathan had taught her to ride 2 months ago and that she had practiced on every morning since, because she'd understood that mobility was safety up here. She put on Nathan's extra coat, hers wasn't heavy enough, and she filled the saddlebag with what she knew she'd need: rope, matches in a waterproof case, the small medical kit she'd put together herself from the supplies in the house, a blanket. She lit the lantern and hung it on the saddle hook, and she led the horse out into the yard. The rain was extraordinary. She could barely see the road. She went anyway. She followed the track up toward the high meadow, and the horse was afraid of the lightning, and she talked to it the whole way, not nonsense, not soothing sounds, but actual words, Nathan's method, low and steady and honest. The lightning isn't going to hit us. We're moving. We're going toward the trees. Keep walking. You know this road, so do I. Keep going. She didn't know if the horse understood her. She thought about Nathan saying it to his horses, and she thought it probably didn't matter whether they understood the words or just the tone, just the certainty that something was not afraid. She was afraid. She knew where the fear was, and she let it be there, and she kept riding. She found Pete Gibbons first. He was at the edge of the tree line, on foot, one hand pressed to the side of his head where he'd hit something in a fall. He was upright and conscious, which was the first relief, and when he saw her lantern he called out, and she rode to him, and he grabbed her stirrup. "Mr. Cole," Pete said immediately. His horse spooked at a lightning strike. There was a tree came down. I don't know where he went. I came off mine, and by the time I got up his horse was gone. He was breathing fast, not quite coherent. The specific fragmentation of a frightened young person trying to report an emergency while still inside it. "Which direction?" "Northeast," Pete said. "Toward the creek." She knew the creek. Nathan had shown it to her on a morning ride, pointed out where it ran fast in spring runoff, where the bank was unstable, where the rocks broke through the surface. She knew the northeast edge of the property well enough. She'd ridden the fence line there twice. "Can you walk?" Pete said. "Get down to the ranch. Stay inside. If I'm not back by morning, ride to town and get help." "Miss Whitmore," not unkindly, firmly. He went. She rode northeast. She found Nathan's horse first tied itself up in a fallen branch, unhurt but completely done with the entire situation, standing with its head down in an attitude of profound equine resentment. She secured it to a tree and kept going on foot, because the terrain toward the creek was too rough and too dark for riding. And she carried the lantern in one hand and picked her way through the mud and the fallen branches and the particular menace of a mountain forest in a full storm. She called his name, once, twice, listening between calls for any answer the storm would let through. The third time she called, she heard something, not words. Just a sound, low, involuntary, the kind of sound a person makes when they're hurt and trying not to be. She moved toward it. He was on the bank of the creek, on his back, with a section of fallen pine across his legs. Not his whole body. The trunk had glanced off something else before it hit him. Or it would have been much worse, but the weight was enough that he couldn't move, and the creek bank was saturated mud that was actively pulling him toward the water. And he was conscious, but just barely, and when Clara's lantern found him, he turned his head toward the light and said something she didn't catch. She knelt beside him in the mud. "How bad?" she said. "Legs," he said. "Don't think they're broken, just pinned." She looked at the trunk. It was too heavy to lift. She looked at what she had, the rope. She rigged it around the narrowest section of the trunk, looped it around the nearest standing tree at an angle that would roll the log away rather than lift it. She'd watched Nathan move fence posts this way. The physics of leverage rather than the physics of strength, and she pulled. It required every piece of strength she had, and then something past that, something that came from a place she hadn't known was available to her. The particular reserves of a person who has decided that failure is not a category that currently exists. The log rolled. Nathan made a sound she was going to think about later. "Can you move?" He tried. His legs moved not freely, Not without pain, but they moved. Which meant what he'd said was right. Not broken, bruised severely and possibly worse but functional. He got himself to sitting with her arm behind his back, and then he sat there breathing for a moment, and she knelt in the mud beside him, with her hand on his back to make sure he stayed upright. And the rain came down on both of them, with total democratic indifference. "You came after me," he said. "Pete's horse came back alone," she said. "What did you expect me to do?" He stopped. Breathed. "I don't know what I expected. I brought rope and medical supplies," she said. "Can you stand me a minute?" She gave him the minute. Then she helped him up. It cost both of them something, him in pain and her in sheer physical effort, but they got him upright and she got her shoulder under his arm, and they started moving back through the trees. Slowly, the lantern in her free hand, the storm still going. He was heavy. She was not a large woman. She walked anyway. "The cattle," he said at one point. "Our cattle," she said. "They'll find shelter or they won't. We're not going back for them tonight." Pause. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. It took them 40 minutes to reach the horses. Another 30 to get back down to the ranch, Nathan on his horse and Clara on hers, moving slowly enough that she could keep one hand near his arm in case he started to go. He didn't go. He made it. Inside the ranch house, with the fire rebuilt and the lamp lit and the storm still working through its final hours outside, Clara did what she knew to do with the medical kit. He had a deep bruise along both shins and a cut on his forearm from something in the fall, and his shoulder had taken a blow that was going to be stiff for days. She cleaned the cut and wrapped it and checked his pupils, and asked him questions to make sure the fall hadn't affected his head. And he answered all of them with the cooperative patience of a man who had decided arguing was less efficient than letting someone competent do their job. When she finished, he said, "Sit down." "I'm fine," she said. "Clara," he said, "sit down." She sat. She was shaking slightly. She hadn't noticed it until she stopped moving, the way you didn't notice how cold you were until you were out of the wind. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and made herself breathe. Nathan looked at her from across the table. His face was pale and tired and marked with mud, and his arm was wrapped in her bandaging, and he looked at her with that expression again, the one she had no satisfactory name for. "I've been alone up here for 3 years," he said. She said nothing. "Before that I had Joel," he said. "And you know how that ended, and before that stopped. It's been a long time since there was someone I could rely on. Someone who stayed. The fire was loud. The storm was quieter now, working down from its peak. I know you didn't come here to be that person," he said. "You came here because you had no other option. I know that." "I knew that from the first night," he paused. "But somewhere in the past months, that stopped being the whole story." Clara looked at her hands. "Nathan, I'm not asking you to answer that right now," he said. I need you to know that I know the difference. Between someone who's here because they need shelter and someone who rolls a log off a man in a creek in a mountain storm because they decided he was worth going after." He looked at her steadily. "Those aren't the same person." "No," she said. "They're not." They looked at each other for a moment, and the space between what was said and what was not said was very thin, and Clara was aware of everything: the warmth of the fire, the quiet of the storm, the way his eyes held hers without flinching. The fact that she was sitting in a ranch kitchen at 10 o'clock at night covered in mud and creek water, and she had never in her life felt more exactly herself. "Rest," she said finally. "Your shoulder's going to be worse in the morning, and you need to sleep before it stiffens." "Always practical," he said. "One of us has to be," she said. She got him settled and checked the fire and blew out the lamp and lay down on her own cot and listened to the last of the storm move off the mountain. And she thought about what he'd said, not asking you to answer right now, and thought that the thing about right now being wrong was that it was only temporarily wrong. And temporary was a condition she had some recent experience with things coming out the other side of. She fell asleep with that thought, and the morning came clear and cold and entirely washed clean, the sky a color that had no name she knew, the mountains bright with fresh snow on their highest reaches. Nathan was in the kitchen when she got up. Moving carefully, favoring his left side, but up and functional, and making coffee with the methodical precision of a man who was not going to let a mountain storm and a fallen tree and a night of real pain keep him from his morning routine. He handed her a cup when she came in. She took it. "Thank you, just that. Of course," she said. She sat down. He sat down. They drank coffee in the morning quiet, and outside the ranch was still and bright, and the cattle, most of them were moving in the upper pasture, none the worse for a hard night. And somewhere in Denver a judge had a file with Clara's carefully constructed legal arguments in it, and somewhere in Santa Fe Joel Pruitt was deciding what kind of man he wanted to be. And somewhere in the valley below Dolan Wade was thinking about what he thought was a weakened opponent. He was going to find out he was wrong, but that was for later. For right now Clara Whitmore held her coffee cup in her calloused hands and looked across a rough wooden table a man who had picked up her bags on a platform 6 months ago and once asked her to be a less than she was. And she thought that the whole machinery of what her life had almost been, the elegant house, the established husband, the comfortable predictability of a future built on someone else's image of what she should want it, had been built on something hollow. And this, the hard work and the legal ledger and the flour on her hands and the mud from last night still in her boots and the Ann across the table who had said, "I know the difference," this was built on something real. It was not comfortable. It was not what she'd planned. It was better than what she'd planned in every way that actually mattered. And then Pete Givens came through the door with his head bandaged and his expression urgent, and he said, "Ryder just came up from Black Hollow. There's news from Denver." Clara set down her cup. Nathan looked at her. She was already standing. "What news?" she said to Pete. "The judge alderman. He's been removed from the case." "A beat," Nathan said. Pete looked uncomfortable. "Conflict of interest," he said. "Something about railroad investments." "They're assigning a new judge." He swallowed. "The new judge is coming from Santa Fe. He arrives in Black Hollow in 10 days to review the case files before the Denver hearing." Then Clara said very quietly, "Santa Fe." Nathan looked at her. "Joel Pruitt is in Santa Fe," she said. The implication settled over the table like something physical. "You think that's connected?" Nathan said slowly. "I think that a judge from Santa Fe reviewing this case creates an opportunity," Clara said. "I think we need to contact Crane today." And I think she paused. "I think we need to contact Joel Pruitt today as well." She picked up her cup, finished her coffee, set the cup in the dry sink. "Pete," she said, "can you ride to town this morning?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Good," she said. "I'll have 2 letters ready within the hour." She went to the desk. The story was not over. It was not anywhere close to over. But it was moving. She could feel it, the way you could feel a current in still water, the sense of something larger than what was visible on the surface, pulling everything in a direction that was not yet clear, but was unmistakably deliberate. She dipped the pen. She began to write. The letters went out with Pete Givens that morning, and Clara stood in the yard and watched him ride down the mountain road with the specific feeling of someone who has set something in motion that cannot be called back. And she thought that was probably the right feeling to have, because it meant the thing was real and consequential and worth the cost of being irreversible. Nathan came and stood beside her. His shoulder was wrapped and his face was tight with the effort of standing straight against the pain he wasn't going to mention, and he watched Pete disappear around the first bend in the road. "You think Pruitt will come," he said. "Not a question exactly. More like a man testing a possibility against the reality he knew." "I think he wants to," Clara said. "I think the question is whether want is enough." "It usually isn't," Nathan said. "No," she agreed. "But sometimes people surprise you." She paused. "I surprised myself. 6 months ago I couldn't chop wood or bake bread at altitude or read a survey record or roll a log off a man in a creek. I learned because I had to, and then I learned because I wanted to, and the line between those two things got blurry enough that it stopped mattering which side of it I was on." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "You think Pruitt can get to the same place," he said. "I think everyone has at least one moment where they can decide who they're going to be," Clara said. This might be his. She went back inside. There was work to do, and there was always work to do, and she had learned that work was the thing that kept the fear from becoming the loudest thing in the room. Crane's response came 2 days later, and it was the most significant letter she had read since Everett Collins's 6 sentences, though for entirely opposite reasons. Aldous Crane had been doing his own investigating. He had, with the combination of legal skill and sheer professional doggedness that Clara had begun to rely on as much as her own analytical ability, gone back to the original deed transfer between Joel Pruitt and Dolan Wade, not just the surface documentation, but the chain of events surrounding it, the witnesses, the timing, the financial records of both parties in the weeks preceding the sale. And he had found something. He had found that Dolan Wade had paid the gambling debt himself. Not through intermediaries, directly. His own money cleared through a bank in Pueblo 3 days before Pruitt signed the deed. Which meant Wade had not simply taken advantage of a desperate man's situation. He had manufactured it. He had paid the debt holders men who operated outside the law and had no reason to be gentle in their methods, and then waited for them to apply the pressure that drove Pruitt to the only exit he could see. The exit that led directly to Wade's waiting hand. It was not just coercion, it was orchestrated coercion. It was a scheme. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table with Nathan across from her, and she was very still while she read it, and when she finished she set it down and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "Tell me," Nathan said. She told him. All of it, plainly and completely, the way she did everything. The silence that followed was long. Nathan stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and gave him whatever time the situation required. "He engineered it," Nathan said finally. "The whole thing. From the beginning." From the beginning, Clara confirmed. "Joel didn't just sell," Nathan said. "Joel was pushed to the edge and handed a ladder that led straight into a trap." Yes, he turned around. His face was doing something complicated, the specific emotional labor of a man revising a 3-year-old narrative that had calcified into the bedrock of how he understood his own life. The betrayal had been real, the damage had been real. But the story he'd been telling himself, that Joel had chosen money, had weighed their friendship against profit, and found the friendship lighter, that story was wrong. Joel had been a weak man in a frightened moment who had been very carefully maneuvered into the worst decision of his life by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. "This changes the criminal exposure," Clara said carefully. "What Wade did, paying the debt holders, directing the coercion, that's potentially fraud. It's not just a civil matter anymore. Crane knows this," Nathan said. "Crane knows this," she confirmed. "He's already been in contact with the Territorial Marshal's office." Nathan sat back down. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for a moment, and Clara waited. And when he looked up, his expression had cleared into something she recognized as the particular clarity of a man who has just had a very complicated situation simplified. "What do we need to do?" he said. "We need Joel Pruitt's sworn statement documenting the coercion as he experienced it," Clara said. "We need it to confirm the details Crane has found from the financial records. And we need it before the new judge arrives from Santa Fe." "He has 6 days," Nathan said. "Yes, if he's coming," Nathan said. "If he's coming," Clara agreed. Joel Pruitt arrived on the 5th day. Clara saw him coming up the road from the kitchen window at midday, and she recognized him only because Nathan had described him once medium height, sandy-haired. The kind of face that looked younger than its age in a way that probably hadn't served him well in the company of harder men. He rode a hired horse from Black Hollow, and he rode it badly, which meant he hadn't spent much time on horseback recently, which meant Santa Fe had changed his life in ways he probably hadn't chosen. She went out to meet him before Nathan saw him from the barn, and she intercepted him in the yard, and he pulled up when he saw her and looked uncertain. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. "I'm glad you came." He dismounted slowly, like a man who had spent a long time working up to this moment and was now finding that arriving was its own kind of difficult. He looked at the ranch, at the barn, the house, the yard, the particular physical fact of the place he'd helped build, and then signed away, and something crossed his face that she chose not to examine too closely because it was private in the way that grief is private. "Isn't he started?" "He's in the barn," Clara said. "I want to say something to you first, before you see him." She waited until he met her eyes. "What you're doing today is the harder thing. You know that. It would have been easier to stay in Santa Fe and let this play out without you. I need you to know that I know the difference, and that it matters." Pruitt looked at her for a moment. "Your letter," he said. "In Santa Fe, that was stopped."
I read it 4 times.
Did it help? She said. It was the thing that made me get on the horse, he said simply. She nodded once. Then she said he's not going to make it easy. He has every right not to. But he also needs your statement, and I think somewhere underneath the part that's angry, he knows why you made the choice you made, even if he can't say so yet. Is he? Pruitt hesitated. Is he all right? I heard about the legal trouble. The petition. He will be, Clara said. He has good representation now, and the case has changed significantly in the past 2 weeks. She paused. That's partly why we need you. She brought him to the barn. She didn't stay for what happened between them in the first minutes. She walked away and went into the house and gave them the room, because some things needed to happen without witnesses. She could hear the low register of 2 men's voices through the barn wall, not the words, just the sound, and at one point the sound stopped entirely for a long stretch, and that was the loudest moment of all. When they came out, Nathan was pale and Pruitt looked like he'd been wrung out, and neither of them was looking at the other yet. But neither of them was walking away from the other either, which was its own kind of answer. Nathan looked at Clara. He nodded, once. Mr. Pruitt needs to give his statement, she said. I've written out the questions Crane needs answered. I can serve as witness to the signature. She served as witness. She sat at the kitchen table with her ledger and her pen, and she walked Joel Pruitt through every relevant detail with the methodical care of someone who understood that sworn testimony was only as useful as it was precise. Pruitt answered everything. He did not minimize, and he did not excuse, and he did not leave out the parts that made him look worst, which Clara took as evidence that he had made his decision fully and intended to honor it fully. When it was done, she sealed the statement and addressed the envelope to Crane in Denver. I'll take it to town myself, Nathan said. He looked at Pruitt. You can sleep in the barn tonight if you need to rest before the ride back. It was not warmth, it was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was something, the particular offer of a man who had been raised to believe that basic human decency was not contingent on personal feeling, that a person could be hurt and still be decent, that those two things were not in conflict. Pruitt said thank you, and then quietly, I know that's not easy. Nathan said no, and he picked up his coat and the envelope and went to saddle the horse, and that was all that was said, and it was enough for the moment. The new judge arrived in Black Hollow the following morning. His name was Harlan Beckett, and he was 62 years old and had spent 35 years applying territorial law in a landscape that required him to be both scholarly and practical. And he had a reputation Clara had asked around, and Crane had confirmed, for being almost impossibly difficult to and equally impossible to mislead. He was not a man who made decisions on presentation. He made them on substance. Clara considered this and felt something that was almost like relief. She and Nathan rode into Black Hollow together to meet with Crane, who had arrived from Denver the previous evening and had taken a room at the only hotel, which was a generous description of the establishment. Crane was a tall, spare man with the particular economy of movement that Clara associated with people who spent most of their lives in rooms full of papers, and when he saw her he shook her hand first before Nathan's, which she noted and which Nathan noticed her noting. Your analysis of the tenancy structure was correct, Crane said to her, in the assayer's office that had become an unofficial headquarters for their side of the matter. And the coerced transfer argument, given the financial documentation, is now the central spine of the defense. We're not just fighting the partition petition anymore. You're pursuing the fraud claim, Clara said. The Territorial Marshal's office is pursuing the fraud claim, Crane said carefully. We're pursuing the deed invalidation, which is the civil matter. The criminal investigation is parallel but separate. What I need from you both today, he looked at Nathan, is a clear and accurate account of every piece of pressure Wade has applied to this since he acquired the 40%. Everything. The fence cutting, the visit, the conversation with Miss Whitmore. All of it. They gave it to him. All of it, from the first conversation in the yard, through the legal papers, through the cut fences, through Wade's visit with Price. Clara had her ledger with her, and she read from it directly where her memory needed supplementing, and Crane listened without interrupting and took his own notes. And when they were done, he looked at the ledger with an expression that was professionally neutral, but contained something that might have been respect. You kept this from the beginning, he said to Clara. From when I realized the pattern, she said. If I had had a client who kept records like this from the outset of a dispute, he stopped himself. This is going to be very useful. The hearing before Judge Beckett was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning in the Black Hollow Courthouse, which was a single room in the back of the municipal building, with 4 rows of wooden benches and a judge's table, and the particular gravity of a space where serious things happened. Clara sat in the front row beside Nathan, and Crane sat beside Nathan, and across the aisle Harrison Price sat beside Dolan Wade, and Wade looked at Clara when he came in with the same assessing look he'd worn in the ranch yard. The look that was taking her measure and deciding how dangerous she was. She met it with the same steady calm she'd given it every other time. You couldn't rattle someone who had decided they were not rattleable. That was something Clara had learned about herself in the months since Black Hollow, that the quality she'd always thought of as stubbornness was actually something more useful, more structural. More like the grain of certain wood that refused to split along any line you chose for it. Judge Beckett entered and the room stood and the judge sat and the room sat and the hearing began. What happened in that room over the next 3 hours was to Clara the most significant work she had ever witnessed. Crane was extraordinary, precise, forceful, genuinely brilliant in the way he built the argument from foundation to peak, each piece laid so that the next piece couldn't be denied without pulling down what came before. He presented the deed structure and the tenancy terms and the water rights analysis. He presented the financial documentation of Wade's payment to the debt holders. He presented Emmett Birch's sworn statement and the statements of 2 other former landowners from Clara's ledger. He presented Joel Pruitt's testimony, and then he presented Clara's ledger itself. Judge Beckett examined it for a long time. He asked her 2 questions from the bench, which was not common procedure, and Clara answered them directly and without elaboration, and the judge looked at her over his glasses and said nothing further and went back to the ledger. Price made his arguments. They were good arguments. He was a skilled lawyer, and Wade had given him real ammunition. But the financial records were insurmountable, and the ledger was comprehensive, and Pruitt's testimony was specific and credible, and by the time both sides had finished, Clara had the sense of a tide that had turned decisively. Judge Beckett took 2 hours to deliberate. Clara and Nathan sat outside on the wooden sidewalk in the afternoon light, and Crane sat with them, and none of them spoke very much. There was nothing left to say that was useful. The work was done. Now they waited. Nathan had his elbows on his knees and his hat in his hands, and he was looking at the main street of Black Hollow at the train station visible at the far end. At the platform where 6 months ago a woman in a wedding dress had stood alone with $4.37 and no plan. Do you think about it? He said, not specifying what. Clara looked at the platform too. Sometimes, she said. Less than I used to. If he'd sent the return ticket, Nathan said slowly. If the money had been in the envelope, I'd have taken the train back to Virginia, Clara said. And you'd be here alone, fighting Wade with a ledger that had errors in it, and a deed you weren't sure was clean. She paused. And the north fence would have gone down, and you would have had no one to tell you it was deliberate. And I wouldn't have had anyone to come looking for me in the creek, Nathan said. No, she said. He put his hat on. He looked at his hands for a moment. I've been trying to work out how to say something, he said. And I haven't found the right words, so I'm going to say it in the wrong words, and you can translate. All right, she said. I don't want you to stay because you don't have anywhere else to go, he said. I haven't wanted that for a long time, maybe ever. He looked at her. I want you to stay because you want to be here, because this is the life you'd choose if you could choose anything. He paused. And if it's not if you want the train, or Virginia, or something I can't give you, I'd rather know that than have you here, because the alternatives ran out. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about Virginia. She thought about the parlors and the social obligations and the slow suffocation of a life spent being decorative in other people's houses. She thought about Everett Collins and 6 sentences and the specific hollow feeling of being chosen as a means to someone else's end. Then she thought about the ranch, about the chickens who knew her step, about the ledger on the desk that was filled with her handwriting. about flour on her hands and calluses on her palms, and the letter from Aldous Crane that she had written in her head before she wrote it on paper because she'd learned to think in legal structure, and that was a thing nobody could take back. About a man who talked to horses in real words and washed his own dishes and picked up a stranger's bags on a platform full of people who looked the other way. "Nathan," she said, "I sold my wedding dress and went looking for a lawyer and rolled a log off you in a creek in a mountain storm." He looked at her. "That's not the behavior of a woman who's here, because the alternatives ran out," she said. Something happened in his expression, something that was relief and more than relief, something that had been held back a long time by a man who had learned very thoroughly that wanting things and losing them was connected, and that the safest strategy was not to want too visibly. He reached over and took her hand, not the careful momentary gesture from the kitchen table weeks ago. Deliberate, he held it. "No," he said, "I reckon it isn't." They were sitting like that when Crane came out of the courthouse door and said, "Judge Beckett is ready." The courtroom was very quiet when the judge returned. Wade sat with his jaw set in the specific rigidity of a man who has survived enough reversals to know when one is coming, but hasn't yet accepted that it's arrived. Price was professionally unreadable. The handful of townspeople in the back rows were very still. Judge Beckett set his papers on the table and looked at both sides and said, "I'm going to be direct about what this case actually is, because I think we've all spent enough time pretending it's something simpler." He paused. "The petition for partition is dismissed," he said, "on the grounds that the underlying deed transfer from Joel Pruitt to Dolan Wade was procured through deliberate financial coercion orchestrated by the petitioner. A deed transfer obtained through coercion is voidable at the election of the original co-owner, in this case Nathan Cole, and I am finding that the deed transfer is hereby voided." The room took a breath. Clara's hand tightened on Nathan's. Furthermore, Beckett said, "I am referring the financial documentation presented by the respondent's counsel to the Territorial Marshal's Office for investigation of fraud. That is a separate matter and will proceed on its own course." He looked at Wade over his glasses. "I would advise you, Mr. Wade, to make yourself available to the Marshal's office and to retain counsel capable of handling criminal matters, because Mr. Price's specialty is real property law, and what is coming is not a real property matter." Wade's face was very still. Price was already leaning toward him, speaking quietly. "Nathan Cole retains full ownership of the ranch property under the original 60% structure," Beckett continued. "Joel Pruitt's 40%, as the voided transfer returns to the original ownership structure, reverts to Pruitt, who may at his election cell donate or otherwise transfer that share through lawful means." He looked at Crane. "Your client should work with counsel to formalize the updated deed registration with the Territorial Land Office." "Yes, Your Honor," Crane said. "This hearing is concluded," Beckett said. He stood, and the room stood. And then he was gone, and the sound of everything came back at once: movement, voices, the creak of benches, the particular noise of a room returning to itself after a held moment. Clara stood. Nathan stood. He looked at her for a long moment. And she looked at him. And there was so much in that look that she didn't try to inventory it, she just let it be what it was. Complete and real and earned. "Well," Nathan agreed. Crane was shaking Nathan's hand. Price was steering Wade toward the door. The townspeople were murmuring. Pete Gibbons, who had come down for the hearing and been sitting in the back row with his bandaged head held high, let out a sound that was emphatically not a whoop, but that definitely contained the emotional content of one. Clara found herself laughing, not the polite social laugh she'd practiced in Virginia parlors, but the real kind, the kind that came from somewhere past the careful management of impression, the kind she'd been discovering she was capable of, since the mountain had stripped away the things she'd built to protect herself from needing to feel anything too fully. Nathan looked at her laughing, and the expressions on his face was one she was going to remember for the rest of her life. Outside, after the legal formalities and Crane's careful notes and Pete's barely contained excitement and the long walk through a town full of people who had watched the whole thing unfold and were now actively revising the story they told about the abandoned bride and the mountain rancher, outside, in the clear afternoon, Nathan and Clara stood beside the horses and looked at each other. "I want to go home, Clara," he said. They rode back up the mountain together, and the road was the same road it always was, rocky, steep, lined with pines that smelled like resin and cold air, and the ranch appeared around the bend the same way it always did, low and solid and built for endurance. The chickens were in the yard, the horses in the pasture. The kitchen garden that Clara had expanded in the early spring was green and deliberate against the mountain soil. It was not elegant. It was not what she'd been promised in a letter from a man who turned out to be made of paper. It was real. 2 weeks after the hearing, Joel Pruitt came back to the ranch one more time. He came with papers, legal papers, Crane's name on them, properly witnessed. He had spoken to a lawyer in Pueblo. His 40% of the ranch, legally restored to him by Judge Beckett's ruling, was not something he wanted or deserved to profit from, and he knew it. The papers transferred his share to Nathan Cole, permanently, for the price of $1, which was the minimum lawful consideration for a legal transfer of property. Nathan, those papers for a long time. Clara stood beside him and said nothing. "Why?" Nathan said finally. Pruitt looked at the ranch, at the barn built together, at the fence line, at all of it, "because it was always yours," he said. "I just needed someone to tell me it was all right to admit it." He looked at Clara when he said it. She held his gaze and nodded once. Nathan and Joel Pruitt shook hands, a long handshake, the kind that contained more than a handshake, the kind that acknowledged without resolving, that moved forward without pretending backward was erased. It wasn't reconciliation, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was something more pragmatic and perhaps more honest. Two men who had been through something together, deciding that the something no longer had to define everything. Pruitt rode back down the mountain, and they watched him go, and the mountain was quiet around them, and the life they had been building was more real and more solid than it had ever been. And there was still work to do. There was always work to do, and they both knew it, and neither of them minded. That evening, Nathan Cole sat across from Clara Whitmore at a kitchen table in a mountain ranch in Colorado Territory, in the year 1879, with a deed in his desk drawer that had his name on it entirely, and a woman across from him who had arrived in a wedding dress with $4.37 and no plan, and had built herself out of mountain air and hard work, and the kind of anger that converts itself into fuel, into someone the mountain had recognized as its own. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. He reached into his shirt pocket and put something on the table between them. It was a ring, plain silver, simple, not elegant. The kind of ring a mountain rancher could make himself from silver ore pulled from the creek and worked at the forge in the barn during the hours between dusk and full dark over the past 3 weeks. Clara looked at it. She looked at him. "I'm not Everett Collins," he said. "I'm not going to promise you elegant houses or easy lives or anything that sounds better than it is. What I've got is this ranch and this mountain, and the work of keeping both standing, and the particular kind of life that comes from doing hard things well with someone you trust beside you." He paused. "But I'm also not going to write you 6 sentences and disappear. I'm not going to ask you to be less than you are, and I'm not going to let you face anything alone as long as I'm standing." Clara's hands were flat on the table. "That's a better offer than most people get," she said. "Is it enough?" he said. She reached across the table and picked up the ring. She put it on. "It's everything," she said. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood in the last gold of the evening, enormous and permanent, indifferent to the small human things happening in their shadow, and also somehow in the way of very old and very large things, deeply aware of them. The ranch was solid, and the cattle were in the pasture, and the chickens were roosting, and the ledger on the desk was accurate to the last cent, and the deed in the drawer had one name on it, and the ring on Clara Whitmore's hand was plain silver and real. She had come to Black Hollow, Colorado, to begin a new life. She had not gotten the life she came for. She had gotten something harder and truer, and altogether better, a life she had built with her own hands, out of her own strength, in a place that had tested everything she thought she was, and found more underneath than she'd known was there. She was not the woman who had been left on the platform. She was not the woman who had been described in 6 sentences and discarded. She was not the woman her relatives had managed and maneuvered and kept small for 29 years. She was Clara Cole, the woman who had rolled a log off a man in a creek, and corrected a ledger and written legal letters, and sold her wedding dress, and built a case that brought down Dolan Wade, and baked bread at altitude, and learned to ride, split wood, and trust again, which was the hardest and the most important of all of them. And the life she was living was not a rescue, it was not a fairy tale. It was not the comfortable predictability of a future built on someone else's image of what she should want. It was hers, completely, entirely, irrevocably hers, and she had chosen every single inch of it.